Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover a shocking story of betrayal and murder. Sandra had always been close to her daughter, Leah. Their bond was unshakable, a mother-daughter relationship built on years of trust and love. Leah and Benjamin, her husband, had been married for 5 years, and although their marriage seemed solid, there were subtle cracks that Sandra couldn't ignore. Benjamin, once the charming and considerate man she had welcomed into the family, had changed over time. His temper had become unpredictable, and he was often distant, not just from Leah but also from Sandra. Something felt off, though Sandra couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Benjamin's best friend, Kyron, was frequently at their house, and his presence only added to Sandra's unease. Kyron was a tall, imposing man, with a reputation for being wild and unpredictable. His carefree attitude was a stark contrast to Benjamin's increasingly agitated nature. It wasn't that Sandra disliked him, but she couldn't help but feel that something about his relationship with Benjamin was too close an intimacy that didn't sit well with her. One Friday evening, Leah had to work late, leaving Sandra and Benjamin alone in the house. Benjamin, as usual, invited Kyron over for drinks. The two men had a history, and Sandra often felt like a third wheel when Kyron was around. At first, the night seemed typical. The men laughed, shared stories, and opened a few bottles of wine. But as the night wore on, Sandra noticed the tension between them building. Benjamin's mood shifted from jovial to irritated, and Kyron seemed to provoke him with subtle jabs. Sandra, feeling uncomfortable, decided to excuse herself and retreat to the living room. She didn't want to be a part of whatever was brewing between them. However, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt like a cage. She told herself to shake off the feeling, but something in the air made her nervous. That's when it happened. The two men entered the living room, and before Sandra could react, Benjamin grabbed her arm and forced her to stay seated. Kyron stood behind him, a sinister look on his face. Sandra's heart raced, but she had no time to think. Benjamin's grip tightened, and in an instant, the situation took a terrifying turn. The once charming son-in-law and his friend revealed their true intentions. Sandra was trapped, vulnerable and alone. It was a nightmare beyond her worst fears. What followed was an assault that shattered her sense of safety, turning her world upside down in a single horrific moment. The aftermath of that terrible night left Sandra broken in ways she couldn't begin to describe. She tried to process what had happened, but the emotional and physical trauma weighed heavily on her. In the days that followed, she withdrew into herself, unable to talk to anyone about the nightmare she had endured. The once strong, independent woman was now a shell of her former self, gripped by shame, fear, and confusion. She felt like she was living in a fog, unable to escape the memories of the assault that haunted her every waking moment. Her relationship with Leah began to suffer. Sandra tried to act normal in front of her daughter, but the strain was undeniable. She was often distant and uncommunicative, retreating into her room at odd hours. At first, Leah attributed her mother's behavior to stress, assuming that Sandra was simply going through a tough time. But as days passed, Leah noticed the changes growing more pronounced. Her mother, who had always been warm and engaged, was now distant and withdrawn. Sandra stopped calling her for regular check-ins, stopped making the effort to join family meals, and her eyes seemed perpetually clouded with sadness. Leah had always been close to her mother, and her intuition told her that something was wrong, but Sandra refused to speak about it. Every time Leah pressed, Sandra would smile faintly and say she was fine, that it was just a phase. But deep down, Leah felt that her mother was hiding something dark and painful that she couldn't bring herself to share. Meanwhile, Benjamin and Kyron went on as if nothing had changed. They continued their lives without a second thought, unaware or indifferent to the impact their actions had caused. Benjamin tried to reassure Leah that everything was fine, that her mother was simply dealing with some personal issues, but Leah could sense the tension between them. It was as if Benjamin's behavior had become more erratic, his temper unpredictable. Sometimes he would snap at her over minor things, his mood swings becoming more frequent. Kyron's visits to the house also became more frequent, adding to Leah's discomfort. She began to wonder about the nature of their friendship, sensing that there was something more beneath the surface. Every time she saw them together, she felt a strange unease, as if they were hiding something, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Sandra's silence about the assault only deepened the chasm between her and Leah. She was trapped in her own private torment, unable to speak out, unable to ask for help. The fear of destroying her daughter's life and the shame of what had happened kept her silent. Each day, the weight of the secret grew heavier, pushing her further into isolation, and as Sandra's mental health continued to deteriorate, the truth remained locked away, eating away at her from the inside. Sandra's mental state continued to deteriorate, the trauma of what had happened eating away at her. She couldn't escape the vivid memories of that horrific night, the feeling of helplessness, and the overwhelming shame. Her health was in a downward spiral, and she began to isolate herself even more. Sandra could no longer keep the secret inside, but the fear of what might happen if she told the truth paralyzed her. She feared the consequences not only for herself but for Leah and her marriage. The thought of destroying her daughter's life, of shattering the perfect image of her family, was too much to bear. One evening, as Sandra sat alone in her bedroom, her mind raced with thoughts of what to do. The pain was unbearable, and she couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Her thoughts became clearer. She needed to tell someone, anyone, about the assault. But who could she trust? She couldn't go to the police, she couldn't go to Leah, and she couldn't confide in any of her friends. The risk of losing everything, of exposing Benjamin and Kyron, felt too great. It was then that Sandra made the decision. She reached out to a close friend, someone she had known for years, and arranged to meet at a nearby cafe. The moment she sat down across from her friend, the dam inside her broke. Sandra's tears flowed freely as she recounted the events of that fateful night, the assault, and the overwhelming feelings of betrayal and shame. She explained how Benjamin, the man she had once considered a son, had turned into something unrecognizable, and how Kyron, his friend, had played a part in the assault. Her friend listened in shock and disbelief, unable to comprehend what Sandra had just revealed. Sandra's voice trembled as she described how the men had taken away her sense of safety, how everything she once trusted had crumbled in an instant. But what followed was the worst of it all: Sandra's own guilt. She felt responsible for not speaking out sooner, for not doing more to protect herself. The weight of the secret had crushed her spirit, and now that it was out in the open, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Her friend, though sympathetic, urged Sandra to go to the police, to seek justice for what had been done to her. But Sandra recoiled at the thought. The idea of facing Benjamin and Kyron in a courtroom, of tearing apart her daughter's world, was too much to bear. She promised her friend she would think about it, but deep down, Sandra knew she wasn't ready to face the consequences of her decision. She felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape, her heart torn between the desire to seek justice and the fear of losing everything she had ever known. Leah's concern for her mother grew as the days passed. Despite Sandra's attempts to maintain the facade of normalcy, Leah could see through the cracks. Her mother had become increasingly distant, her behavior erratic and withdrawn. Sandra had always been the cornerstone of the family, the woman who held everything together, but now she seemed fragile, lost in a fog of despair. Leah tried to reach out, but every time she pressed her mother for answers, Sandra would deflect, offering weak excuses and vague reassurances. The distance between them widened, and Leah felt helpless, unsure of how to help her mother. One night, Leah confronted Benjamin about Sandra's behavior, hoping he could shed some light on what was happening. But Benjamin only shrugged it off, claiming that Sandra was just going through a tough time. He suggested that Leah give her mother some space, and Leah reluctantly agreed, though something in her gut told her Benjamin wasn't being entirely truthful. As the weeks wore on, Leah began to notice even more troubling signs. Sandra's once vibrant demeanor had turned hollow, and her mental state seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. There were moments when she appeared lost, disconnected from reality, and Leah started to worry that something much deeper was wrong. It wasn't just stress, it was as though her mother had lost the will to fight. Leah's suspicions deepened when she overheard a conversation between Benjamin and Kyron one evening. The two men were in the living room, their voices lowered but still audible. Leah couldn't make out every word, but the tone of the conversation was enough to make her stomach twist. There was an underlying tension, a strange camaraderie that felt unnatural. It wasn't the first time she had felt uncomfortable around Kyron, but now something felt different, darker. The following day, Leah found Sandra in the kitchen, her eyes hollow, her face drawn. She had been sitting in the same spot for hours, staring blankly out the window. Leah's heart ached seeing her mother in this state. She tried again to get Sandra to open up, but this time Sandra's response was different. Her voice trembled as she told Leah that she could talk about it, that she wasn't ready to tell her the truth. It was then that Leah realized her mother was hiding something that was slowly breaking her. The more Leah thought about it, the more she pieced together the fragments of her mother's behavior, the odd tension between Benjamin and Kyron, and the strange changes in her own home. The pieces didn't fit, but the picture they were starting to form was too terrifying to ignore. Leah could no longer sit idly by, wondering what was happening to her mother. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The danger was closer than she had imagined. Leah's suspicion finally reached its breaking point. The more she observed, the more she began to understand that something was deeply wrong, something far beyond the simple tension she had noticed between her mother and the men in her life. Her fears were confirmed when she found a journal her mother had been keeping hidden, tucked away in the back of a drawer. It was the one thing Sandra had never shared with anyone, and as Leah flipped through the pages, the truth began to unfold. The details of that night of the assault were written in stark, painful words. Each sentence revealed the unimaginable horror her mother had suffered, and with each word, Leah felt her heart sink deeper. The revelation hit Leah like a bolt of lightning. She couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she processed what she had just read. The very men she had trusted, who she had called family, had destroyed her mother. The betrayal was beyond her comprehension, and the realization of what had happened shattered her world. Sandra had suffered alone, too afraid to speak, too terrified to expose her tormentors. Leah was flooded with guilt, knowing she had been so blind to the pain her mother had been enduring. As the shock began to fade, Leah's mind raced with a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. She knew she had to confront Benjamin and Kyron, but she also knew that doing so could be dangerous. They had already shown themselves capable of cruelty. But as her thoughts circled, the next steps became clear. Sandra needed justice, and Leah was determined to make sure the truth was known, no matter the cost. That night, Leah decided to confront her husband and his friend. It was a confrontation that had been building for weeks, one that she had been dreading, but it was inevitable. As Benjamin and Kyron sat in the living room, Leah walked in, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her hands shaking, but she stood tall, ready to face the men who had destroyed everything. The moment was surreal. The air was thick with tension as she laid out the truth, the words that she had spent so long avoiding. Benjamin's face went pale as Leah spoke, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, guilt, or maybe both. But Kyron was different. His reaction was cold, almost calculating, as if he had expected this moment all along. The anger and violence in his eyes sent a chill down Leah's spine. In that moment, everything she had feared became a harsh reality. The men who had once seemed like family were capable of much darker things. Desperation took over as Benjamin, afraid of being exposed, lunged toward Leah, trying to silence her. Kyron's eyes gleamed with malicious intent as he moved to block her, and in the chaos that ensued, Leah realized that her life was in imminent danger. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Benjamin and Kyron, now realizing the gravity of the confrontation, were not willing to let her walk away with this truth. To them, silence was the only option. As Leah fought back, trying to protect herself, the room became a blur of fear and violence. The tragic end that Sandra had suffered was now looming over Leah, who was left with no choice but to survive this nightmare.